Good morning, everybody. Let's get started. It's 9 o'clock, the scheduled time for this to start. I'm Kit Dahl on the council staff, and I'll be giving an overview of some materials under this topic, which is an item on the council's June agenda, agenda item C2. If you look in the briefing materials for that agenda item, you'll see there are two attachments. One is an executive director's report that contains a series of recommendations related to potential changes to council operations. And there's also a staff report that discusses the possible ways the council could prioritize their workload. You may ask, why start with changes in council operations rather than prioritizing the scope of work the council might take on? And I think our feeling is that we can make changes to council operations without compromising the quality or performance of the council or their ability to take on the range of topics and issues that they have been doing heretofore. So with that bit of preface, I'll just also say that I'm going to start out just a little bit of history on this issue. Many of you, probably most of you, are familiar, but for anybody on this webinar that hasn't been tracking this issue until now, I'll go ahead and just go through some background. And this emerged out of a discussion the council had starting really coming out of the pandemic, so 3 years ago, more or less, or a couple of years ago, thinking about how to make the council's work and processes more efficient. And then more recently, within the past year, couple of years, that desire or need really to find those more efficient ways of operating has become more urgent as some budget issues have emerged. And so I'm going to go through now a little bit of background framing the issue before I get to the recommendations that our executive director, Merrick Burden, has made in his report. So really the underlying problem here, we have essentially a long-term deficit of about $800,000. So that is, if you take out our base income or money received and our base budget at using 2024 for that purpose. In terms of, so base income is essentially our share of the line item in the federal budget for fishery management councils. And for this computation, the base budget excludes some soft money sources that we are receiving or expect to receive, but does include some money from a reserve fund that the council has built up. So in terms of sound organizational process, the council has been putting money aside in a rainy day fund, if you will, to smooth out the ups and downs of expenditures. But we've been having to dip into that fund to cover our current obligations, and so we're spending that down. And so this reflects ultimately we're going to be spending down our reserve and by this amount over time, and be getting down to a lower budget level, all things being equal, no changes in congressional appropriations and so on. So that's the problem that we're trying to address here. So looking just, okay, so if we want to change operations and save some money, what are we looking at? I think many of you have seen this pie chart before. It breaks out our expenditures in this year's budget into various categories. And you can see the largest category there is personnel. That accounts for 43% of the total expenditure, followed by travel with 20%. And then you can see there's 4 other categories that add up to 37% of total expenditures. So I'm going to quickly talk through those, what the aspects of those are, and that should help frame the recommendations that are being made. So first, looking at personnel, the biggest chunk there, and there's a lot of words on the screen here, but essentially we have a little bit of a bump up in personnel costs this year having to do with transition. So we have several staff that are retiring or have retired or are retiring through this year, and we're recruiting folks to come in and fill those positions, and we've planned into that some degree of overlap, and so that's leading to pushing up the expenditures on salaries and so on, compensation up by about $100,000 this year, but we expect that to decline beginning next year as the retirees move on, and we have our new folks in place, and it should decline by a bit more than what the bump up was, and that's partly because those who are retiring are senior staff and are compensated at a higher level, and we recognize that the complexity of the work the council does drives the need for that kind of experienced staff, but we are backfilling and recruiting folks starting at more of a, let's say, entry level or lower pay grade. So that will result in some savings, although we should bear in mind that as it will take time for those folks to get up to speed on the council, how it works and its business, and hone their skills, so that may limit some of our capacity in the next couple of years or so. And just emphasizing, I sort of anticipate perhaps there would be a question around this, but we don't have any plans to cut the number of staff, our current staff positions, 16 staff. We just don't think that we can be effective with a smaller staff profile. So that's the kind of, in a nutshell, what is going on in that cost category. So moving on to the next largest one, travel. And travel is really mainly or almost entirely about council meetings and the folks that we bring to council meetings and pay for their attendance in terms of per diem and accommodation. So there are 3 general considerations around council meetings and in affecting this cost category. So one is location. So where do we hold meetings, and depending on where the meeting is held, can be more expensive in terms of both hotel costs and the rates, room rates and per diem rates. And then the size of the meeting, size meaning the number of people participating in the meeting and supported with council travel funds. And then the length of the meeting, and that interacts with the number of people there. It's essentially the number of people by the number of days they are at the meeting, is the product of that is the overall cost in terms of the travel support we're providing. So we can break that down, look at each of these things individually. So if we look at location, probably not news to anybody here, but the major West Coast metros are going to be more expensive places, both in terms of contracts for hotels, but also the rates for lodging and per diem that we pay when we have meetings in those locations. And then that is related to the size, again, the number of people that we have attending council meetings. As meetings are larger, there are limited, fewer places that we can or fewer hotels that we can that can accommodate the council meeting, and it tends to be that those hotels that have the facilities are in those more expensive locations. And as I suggested already, well, I guess I didn't suggest this already, but in terms of travel costs and so on, it's a matter of thinking about both the expenses of lodging, the hotel room rates, and related to that, the per diem rates that vary by location, but also travel costs. You can think of that in terms of how accessible the location is. I think we learned a little bit of a lesson this year in terms of our two meetings in March and April. So we met in Fresno, California in March, and that was a lower cost location, but a little harder to get to. There was less frequent flights in there. Might have been a little bit more expensive tickets to get to Fresno, depending on the origin of travel. And also, just because there are fewer options for flights, it may have meant that some folks who would have had to come earlier or leave later because they couldn't find a flight that would get them there in an efficient manner. So in terms of locations, we need to kind of take both of those aspects into account, and we can contrast that with our April meeting in Seattle, which is kind of the opposite in that we were meeting in downtown Seattle, so those lodging and per diem expenses were higher, but it was a pretty easy place to get to with a major airport and so on. So those travel costs or flight costs of an airplane ticket and so on is maybe a bit lower overall. Okay, so we'll move on to the next consideration. So again, this is where I was kind of already stated this, but if we think about the length of council meetings and the number of people that we're supporting to come to council meetings, that gives us the product of those two as the overall costs. And so kind of have to think about those two factors in concert. So probably the main thing driving in terms of supported attendance at council meeting is the number of advisory bodies that come and meeting in person at a council meeting and the size of those advisory bodies. And then also how long their meetings are. That has, the obvious cost of more meeting days means more room nights and per diem that we're paying, but also it increases the likelihood that we'll have some overlap between advisory body meetings, and the more advisory bodies that are meeting simultaneously, we have to contract with our hotel for more meeting space, and so that will increase the contract costs for the hotel. So then I'll just touch quickly on these other cost categories that you saw. Supplies and services, that's sort of all the stuff that keeps the lights on, essentially. By and large, these are fixed costs. So all of our IT infrastructure, that's all the computers that our staff use, and that, we use a lot of equipment at council meetings, so all of that equipment, and maintaining that and replacing it and so on. The various software and services that we pay licensing fees for, obviously at the lease on our office, large fixed costs, and various other kinds of supplies ranging from, office furniture to pens and pencils. And then also it's noted that in this category are those hotel contracts. So that is one thing here that is more of a variable cost in terms of it's influenced by those considerations I already went over in terms of where council meetings are held. and then we have the next cost category down in terms of fraction of the budget is these state liaison contracts. So we pass through a certain amount of funding to the state governments and Pacific States Marine Fishery Commission to allow their staff to participate in council activities. So that's, we have folks on our various advisory bodies, management teams, and so on. They do a lot of heavy lifting and work in support of council decisions. We need to recognize that work that goes beyond what the agency staff and others might otherwise do in their regular duties. So we support that amount. So that's a contract. So again, it can vary with the scope of council activities, but it would be a matter of renegotiating those contracts and also, in line with slimming down the amount of things that the council takes on and the demands we put on those staff. And then the next category down, we do have contract with various, outside folks to do an analysis, or essentially people that have skills beyond what we might have on staff or beyond what staff has capacity to do. And again, the amount we spend on that can vary depending on what the council's taking on. So bigger projects with more analytical demand or special types of activities like workshops and so on, we would tend to contract with outsiders to bring in the expertise and fill out the council staff capacity. And then finally, we pay stipends. So they're both council member stipends. That's a daily rate that depends on the attendance mainly at council meetings. Could be other forums where we're going to pay that stipend to council members. So that does marginally relate to the length of council meetings. And then we also pay, we have stipends that go to our advisory bodies, advisory subpanels by and large. That is a fixed amount. We receive a line item amount from NOAA, and essentially it's just divvied up equally based on the number of people that attend meetings and on our advisory subpanels, and the people on those subpanels attending meetings. So that could be affected. Well, it can't be, the total amount is really can't be affected. It's pretty much a fixed cost. Obviously, if the number of folks on advisory bodies got smaller, then the stipend amount would increase because it's evenly divided. Okay, so with that bit of background, here are the first set of recommendations. So these are, as noted and suggested by this background, the main thing that we can most easily tackled in terms of expenses is those meeting and travel expenses. So here's a bunch of proposals or recommendations that the executive director made that are contained in this report. So the first one is size of council meetings. So that's the number of people attending. And there are a couple of specific recommendations in there. So first of all, that in terms of the coastal pelagic species FMP advisory bodies, and putting those issues on council agendas, we've cut that to just 2 meetings a year, and HMS, highly migratory species, on 3 meetings a year. And we try to arrange the agendas so we would have less overlap, and so more focus during those meetings on those particular FMP topics. The second recommendation here is to not put groundfish items on the April agenda. In those, it's odd years. Those are the years when the groundfish harvest specifications process is not going on. So it's not really an off year, but it's sort of an off year. And, you know, there may be cases where there is a need to schedule a groundfish item on an April agenda. Maybe an issue comes up and that it needs to be addressed at that time. So a suggestion is that perhaps rather than bringing the full complement of the two advisory bodies, the GMT and GAP, there may be a subgroup or subcommittee, smaller contingent related to perhaps the particular topic that has been scheduled on that April agenda could be brought in to save a bit of money in terms of travel costs. And then finally, you know, some consideration about whether there's any scope for reducing the size of any of our advisory bodies, noting we have had some trouble in recent years in filling vacancies on advisory bodies. That suggests maybe there is some scope for that consideration. We are in this year in the process, or the council is in the process of looking at the next 3-year term for those term limited members of advisory bodies, so mainly folks on subpanels and the SSC and so on. So that could figure into that consideration. That's, you know, under a different agenda topic, but could feed in there. So then the second recommendation is, you know, trying to move away from meeting in the more expensive locations, the big metro areas. As already noted, that really relies on reducing meeting size in terms of attendance. So it's related to what we can do under that first recommendation. And then under this, there is a specific recommendation around our March and April meetings. So those are the two salmon meetings where there's a focus on setting the annual harvest season and harvest specifications for the ocean salmon fisheries. And traditionally, those two meetings have rotated between Northern California location and a Pacific Northwest location. But as already noted, well, not noted, but I'll note it here, overall in terms of expensive places to meet, California tends to have more, especially the big metro areas like the Bay Area and Southern California tend to be expensive places to meet. So the recommendation here is rather than rotating to meet, always have the March meeting in Northern California. Am I back on?
Yeah, we got you back, Kip.
Okay, where did you start missing me? Sorry about that. That was a clip.
Talking about Northern California.
Okay, good. Not very brief, fairly brief break there. So yeah, I was just saying the specific recommendations in terms of this recommendation A2 in terms of location is to, rather than rotating those March and April meetings between Northern California and the Pacific Northwest, is to hold the March meeting in Northern California. That's the slightly smaller meeting of the two. And so we could hold it outside of the Bay Area, more expensive location, perhaps somewhere like Santa Rosa, and the April meeting permanently held in the Pacific Northwest in some lower cost locations like Portland Metro or Tacoma. Okay, moving on, and hopefully I'm still online. The third set of, and there's some sub-bullets here, is in terms of duration or the length of council meetings. And these are sort of tweaks to how we run council meetings that could make them shorter. As if you look at the executive director report in terms of there's a timeline or implementation framework or schedule at the end, and there is a aim to shorten council meetings over time, get it maybe by as a day at least. And so to accomplish that, there are a number of changes in operations that could allow us to shorten the overall length of meetings. So the first is under this roles and responsibility categories. So this is really around what advisory bodies develop reports and make recommendations on. You could say it's sort of a stay in your lane recommendation. The council, and this has evolved over time, but it's increasingly taking on issues that are broader in scope than just one FMP. And in fact, starting this year, we've started a new heading in our agenda reflecting that, so that cross FMP heading. And so it'd be directing advisory bodies to really focus on their area, their FMP or particular area, and not be commenting unless specifically directed on those broader sets of issues that come up. Along with that is a possibility of creating another committee, an ad hoc committee, sort of similar in concept to the Marine Planning Committee, where it would draw on its membership from membership of those topic-specific or FMP-specific advisory bodies, and they would be tasked specifically with commenting on those broader cross-FMP issues. So that might be a way for those advisory bodies to still be able to flow thoughts and recommendations from their perspective into those broader issue areas, cross FMP areas, but without having them, the full advisory body, take up a lot of time drafting reports on those topics. In terms of the second sub-bullet here, operational practices, this is the various thoughts around the time we spend on particular components of council agendas. And the two areas that can take up a lot of time are the public comment. That really depends on the issue, but in general, this is feels like a pretty easy thing to do, is to shorten our current length of public comment periods, eliminate the current distinction that we provide between a longer period for individuals representing organizations and other members, general members of the public, and just shorten that down to a single shorter public comment period. And then also the other big area that can take a lot of time is the presentation of advisory body reports. And some of you on advisory bodies have already perhaps heard some recommendations around this informally, but more formally developing a template or a set of guidelines for how those reports should be drafted and the information in them and how to present information so that it brings forward, elevates the recommendations and highlights those. And there's not the expectation that a lot of the supporting rationale and background would be presented to the council during the presentation of those reports. So I think staff would work on that template that would be formally adopted as a set of guidelines for advisory bodies. And we've discussed a variety of other ways to streamline the presentation of reports, basically around, well, if they're provided to the council earlier, the earlier they're provided, I guess I would say, then the more scope there is for really streamlining the presentation and the understanding that the council will have more opportunity to read the report. It can be sort of taken as read to a greater degree. So various things along those lines that could be considered. Then looking at council discussion, there is a possibility to adopt for the council to put limits on their own discussion and establish various kinds of rules on how long any individual council member can talk during a debate and discussion. This might be especially relevant in terms of outside of the formal discussion and decision making and debate of motions when the councils, for example, are asking questions to advisory bodies or the public and sort of limiting that to more really focus on questions at hand and less sort of using that as an opportunity to promote particular viewpoints. So things like that, again, not yet specific recommendations, but if that was something the council took up, then could pursue that. And then finally, under this category, just telling members of advisory bodies, if they're in session, still in session, that they should not come and sit in during the council's floor discussion on the agenda items under their topic area. So there is a tendency for some advisory bodies to kind of take a break or wrap up and come in and want to listen to the council debate and discuss those topics. But if they are still in session, they should be doing their work and not listening to the council. So, maybe there's some consideration around setting agendas for advisory bodies. Also, it would inform the travel days and things like that. So that's the basic idea. Obviously, those folks from advisory bodies giving the reports would come in to do that. So that's typically the chair or vice chair, unless somebody else is otherwise delegated. And then finally, the third sub-bullet, this administrative matters. So first idea is, instead of our agenda planning session that is at the end of every council meeting, only undertake that a couple times a year, perhaps at a more strategic level, with the understanding, or the council will give latitude for council staff to set the specific agendas based on that strategic discussion. They would consult with the council leadership, the chair and vice chairs, in that process, but we wouldn't have that at every council meeting. Second one is in terms of council recommendations on exempted fishing permits. So NMFS is the one that is responsible for actually evaluating proposals for exempted fishing permits and issuing those permits. And I think the council process has been a very useful way for NMFS to have a mechanism for stakeholder engagement and solicitation of ideas. But the question is, under most of our operating procedures, or I think all of them relating to EFPs, that they outline a 2-meeting process, and there's a question of, is that really necessary, or necessary in all cases, and could we cut those processes, modify those operating procedures so it's just a 1-meeting process? And then similarly, if it involves renewing an existing EFP, just defer that to NMFS and rely on their good judgment in terms of renewals. And then finally, here is possibly recategorizing some kinds of reports that are currently presented under agenda items that are more general in nature, certain kinds of, for example, agency reports and so on, as informational reports. We have a informational report category, so it'd be along those lines. Essentially, the understanding is those materials are available in the briefing materials, but are sort of taken as read by the council and don't need to be presented. And then the fourth recommendation here is in terms of reducing participation in international forums. So the council has been funding travel by council members, some council members, staff, and sometimes some contractors to various kinds of international forums, the tuna RFMOs, Western Central Pacific Fishery Commission and Inter-American Tropical Tuna Commission, the Pacific Halibut Commission, and so on. So essentially eliminating that travel, and really we would rely on NIMS to keep the council up to speed on what's happening in those international forums, rather than having our own folks go and monitor those meetings. It should be noted there are some instances where external funding supports council member participation. So for example, under the implementing legislation for the WCPFC, one of the commissioner seats is designated to a Pacific Council member, and that participation by that person, all the commissioners in that for that forum are funded by a Department of State. So that opportunity would still be there. So those are the range of initial or general ways of improving efficiency, mostly, pretty much all around travel and meetings and things like that. But there is then also a second set of recommendations, and this is more if we can't, if the efficiencies that we implement through that first set are insufficient, and we have spent down our reserves and we're facing a lower budget scenario that we haven't really planned for, then there's some more severe or extreme things that could be done. So first of all would be we could one or more council meetings, just have the council members there in person and have all the advisory bodies meet online and do their work and present to the council remotely. The second possibility would be to move the September council meeting entirely online. So the whole meeting would be held online. I think September was chosen an assessment as perhaps that's a meeting where traditionally, at least, there have been the fewest number of issues that really needed that face-to-face interaction to work through. And then finally would be to narrow the scope of what the council works on, the kinds of initiatives the council takes on, and using some process and methodology to figure out what that scope of issues and work would be. And that takes me to the second report in your briefing materials, and that's the staff report on prioritization. And so I'll just briefly go over the gist of that report. I'd say it has presents in the introduction really a threshold question around whether the council really wants to actually have some kind of formal prioritization process. There's some challenges, I think, in the council process in that, council members represent a broad array of stakeholders, and different stakeholders have different priorities, and so there may be challenges around council coming to agreement on what those priorities should be. And as I mentioned, if we're aiming to move to shorter council meetings, that sort of imposes an external limit on what can be taken up, and the council could just consider continuing in a sort of the current way we do business, a little bit of muddling through or a more ad hoc approach, but not having to confront those uncomfortable discussions around prioritizing issues when not everybody is going to be on board with a particular set of priorities. But if the council does want to take on a more formal process, there are kind of several considerations here. So the first one is, you know, what types of topics to prioritize. So going back to, and I didn't mention this at the outset, but as part of this whole process, the council met as not as the council and this committee of the whole format at the beginning of this year. And during those discussions, one thing that emerged and was reported out on in April was this idea that there are certain core responsibilities or activities the council has sort of essentially around statutory responsibilities. And then, so those are the must-do type of things. And then there are a variety of other things the council take on outside of those core responsibilities and activities. And so the first, so that suggests that's what would be taken on in terms of a prioritization exercise. Although kind of taking last year's agendas as an example, the report does raise a question of how far you can really go. In point of fact, in terms of floor time, it looks like broadly defined, those core activities do take up the bulk of council time. So if you just limit it to those non-core things, you may have limited scope for what you're actually going to prioritize and take off the list and so on. So there's a consideration there. And then how are you going to do it? So that's like who actually engages in some kind of prioritization exercise. Is it the council? Is it a broader consultation with staff, both council and agency staff and advisory bodies and so on? The question here being, who knows about what goes into the scope and complexity of issues and their importance and so on. And then the specific methodology, the paper takes a quick look at, unsurprisingly, this whole issue of work prioritization is many organizations confront, and there's a really wide range of tools that have been used in that regard. So it does a quick rundown of kind of the range of those tools. So it'd be a matter of, if you want to go in this direction, picking a particular way of doing it. And then third is the process. So when does this happen? Suggestion here is it probably doesn't make sense to be going through a prioritization exercise frequently. Again, more of a strategic exercise that you do once a year or something like that with some wiggle room, knowing that things come out of the blue sometimes that have to be considered for adding to agendas. And then as an appendix, there is an example of a tool that could be used. It's maybe a little bit more elaborate across the range of potential ways of doing prioritization. So it's sort of a survey instrument type of tool that would pose various questions along two scales of sort of cost, if you will, or how much work is involved and perceived benefit of taking that action. So it's really out there just to stimulate thinking and discussion should the council want to move in a more formal direction. So that concludes my overview,